Orion Royce guided his battered starship, the Phoenix, through the swirling pink dust of Frontier 7's atmosphere, every alert blinking at him in protest of dangerously low fuel reserves. He'd had his share of planet hopping, from wealthy Alliance colonies to remote edges of barely charted space. But Frontier 7 seemed especially desolate. Gray-brown desert stretched out in every direction, broken only by a few jagged hills and clusters of domed huts or prefabricated metal structures. He scanned the horizon for the outpost's landing pad and finally spotted a rudimentary beacon flickering in the dusty wind. He coaxed the ship toward it, feeling the Phoenix protest with a shudder. A whine of complaining turbines shook the cockpit. He was pushing the old girl to her limits. Still, she was his and no one else's. Orion believed fiercely in staying free of obligations. No crew, no family, no ties to any central authority. Only the job at hand and the promise of a well-earned reward. That, to him, was freedom. When he engaged landing thrusters, the underside of the ship stirred up a veil of desert grit. The Phoenix settled, legs creaking, and the engines powered down with a final sputter. Orion flicked switches to standby, then pushed himself up from the pilot's seat, rolling his stiff shoulders. He tugged at the worn collar of his jacket, then checked his side holster, where a plasma pistol hung snug. Outside, the air was hotter and drier than he'd expected, stinging his nostrils the moment he removed his helmet. The outpost, a cluster of metal walls and flickering hollow signs, looked like it had seen far better days. There was a sign over what appeared to be a general store and refueling station, though the sign's letters glowed faintly, as though the power supply was on its last legs. A handful of ragged inhabitants, some human, many not, walked across the dusty compound. They regarded him with the wary curiosity one might show a stray predator. Orion walked straight to the structure marked refuel, ignoring the stares. He had come for one purpose only, to buy as much reactor fuel as his meager credit account would afford and head back out into orbit. He felt a twinge of annoyance, reminded that the final dogfight on his last contract had drained more fuel than planned. If that scuffle hadn't erupted, he wouldn't be stuck on this backwater planet. He pushed open the door to the station. The interior was marginally cooler and surprisingly well lit, though the hum of cheap neon tubes overhead was grating to his ears. The place had a front counter flanked by shelves of mechanical parts, ration tins, and battered canisters of replacement coolant. A single figure stood behind the counter, her back turned as she pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf. At first glance, he thought she might be human. She was slender, dressed in a worn shirt the color of desert sand, her hair long and softly glowing under the flickering overhead lights. But when she turned at the sound of the door creaking shut, he saw the faint shimmer on her skin, almost as if it reflected the lighting in a subtle halo. Her face was delicately shaped, with high cheekbones and wide, dark eyes. The only jarring detail was the pair of metallic bracelets circling both her wrists. Each one had tiny embedded lights glowing in a slow, rhythmic pattern of red and violet. She noticed him looking at them and self-consciously pulled her sleeves down, trying to hide them. Orion leaned on the counter, cleared his throat, and dropped his credit sheet onto the surface. "I need reactor fuel. Grade A. Enough for a full refill." "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. Her voice was soft, almost musical, with an accent that hinted at a local dialect. She reached for a handheld scanner to assess how much the Phoenix could hold. He guessed she was new to the job. There was a tense edge in the way she moved, as though someone were watching her closely. He had seen a lot in his travels: indentured workers, black market forced laborers, and worse. The lights on those bracelets caught his eye. They looked technological, advanced enough to measure vital signs or perhaps transmit signals. He had come across them once before on a lawless moon in the Odor system, where slavers used them to track their captives. She returned from scanning his credit balance, head bowed. "Your ship can be filled, but you'll have only half your remaining credits left." There was a tremor in her voice. "I can have it done in 30 minutes, if that's acceptable." "That's fine," he muttered. "I'm gonna rush anyway." He motioned toward her wrists. "Those bracelets. You all right wearing them?" She flinched. I'm Fina. Her distress only heightened his suspicion. Slavery was officially banned in the Alliance's core worlds, but outside the official territory, plenty of outposts turn a blind eye. He noticed an older, bulky man standing in a corner booth, sipping from a mug and peering at the scene. He had thick arms, covered in swirling tattoos, and his gaze bore into the girl's back. That sealed it for Orion. The tension, the cagey refusal to talk about the bracelets, the watchful stare of that man in the corner. Everything pointed to her being under duress. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You can tell me if you're being forced to work here. I've seen your type of bracelets before. She glanced around, alarmed. No, that's not. You don't understand. I'm not. Her voice faded. Orion's jaw clenched. He could practically feel that man's glare pressing on them. It made his stomach churn in anger. He'd stumbled on one forced labor ring before, years ago, and it had taken a chunk of his left arm's flesh before he managed to free a group of captives. If something similar was happening now, he wasn't going to walk away. Not after seeing that flash of fear in the girl's face. He reached across the counter, surprising her. Stay still, he whispered, slipping a palm-sized laser cutter from the side pocket of his jacket. I'll get these things off you. Her eyes went wide, pupils contracting in sudden panic. No, wait, please, you don't. The laser cutter hummed. Orion flicked it on with practiced ease, slicing cleanly through the metal band around her left wrist. The severed piece clattered to the floor. The lights flickered out. She gasped, but he was already slicing through the second bracelet. It fell with a dull thud, leaving her delicate wrists free of their blinking devices. He exhaled, a surge of triumph flooding him. You're free, he said, raising his voice just enough that the man in the corner might hear. You don't have to let them keep you in chains. But instead of gratitude, he saw nothing but horror in her eyes. She clutched her bare wrists, her face contorted in misery. Tears welled up, spilling onto her cheeks. Why would you do that? She breathed. He blinked. I was helping you. No, she whispered, tears streaming more freely now. You've ruined everything. Her voice climbed until it cracked. You removed my purity bracelets. We have to get married. Those words collided with Orion's mind, but they made no sense. Her sobs drew the attention of everyone in the station. The bulky man in the corner set his mug down with an audible thunk and strode toward them. Orion felt confusion coil in his gut. Married? What are you talking about? Purity bracelets? She covered her face with trembling hands. They weren't slave cuffs. They were part of our tradition. My people's vow of chastity. Removing them means, she choked, unable to finish the sentence through her tears. The bulky man arrived at the counter, his heavily muscled arms crossed over a barrel-like chest. Multiple tattoos, some swirling geometric shapes, some stylized star patterns curled around his thick forearms. He glowered at Orion, then turned to the girl. Eileen, he said, surprisingly gentle with her name. What happened? She hiccuped. Uncle Gromas, he cut them off. The bracelets are gone. He's claimed me. Orion stared in astonishment. Look, I don't know what your customs are here, but I'm not. I was trying to help. Gromas's expression darkened further. Help? By destroying a sacred tradition that preserves a young woman's honor. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. Those bracelets aren't shackles. They measure her body's responses and ensure she remains pure until marriage. And you just severed them. Eileen was sobbing, pressing her wrist to her chest. Everyone will see the marks. They'll know. Who else would marry me after seeing I've lost them outside a ceremony? The confusion in Orion's mind gave way to mounting panic. I didn't realize. Gromas squared his shoulders. Ignorance is no excuse. On Frontier 7, those who remove the purity bracelets become the rightful spouse, by law and by custom. You have claimed her, whether you intended it or not. All eyes in the outpost were on Orion now. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment and a prickling sense of alarm. I can pay for replacements, he said hurriedly. I'll make restitution, whatever it takes. I didn't mean to offend your culture or ruin her future or replacements. Gromas repeated in a mocking tone. This isn't about money. You can't just pay to undo a breach of sacred custom. You cut them off. That means you must wed her. And quickly, before word spreads that she was defiled. Orion's mouth went dry. Defiled? I didn't. We didn't. He noticed the stares growing more hostile, the hiss of whispers carrying through the small crowd. He glanced at Eileen again, watched the tears glistening on her cheeks. She looked completely devastated. No matter the circumstances, he had no intention of forcing a marriage. At the same time, he didn't want her to be banished or ostracized or whatever punishment might await. She clearly believed her life was ruined. He sighed. Isn't there some alternative? He asked quietly. Eileen sniffled. An arrangement can be made. A short-term marriage that upholds tradition until the vow is either fulfilled or officially dissolved, she said between trembling breaths. But that's still a minimum cycle of time. At least one local month. Until then, you'd be my husband. Her eyes flicked away, red-rimmed and shame-filled, and he couldn't stand the heartbreak in her face. He rubbed his neck, looking around for support. He found none. The others had formed a loose circle. Some seemed sympathetic to Eileen, but that sympathy wasn't extended to him. They likely assumed he was just another outworlder with no respect for local beliefs. He felt a swirl of regret and guilt. He was usually so careful, never meddling in local affairs unless absolutely necessary. This time, he jumped in headfirst, thinking himself the hero. Gromas finally let out a heavy breath. If you're honorable enough to set things right, you'll come to my place tonight. We can discuss how the wedding will proceed tomorrow. He put a hand on Eileen's shoulder. She wiped her tears, nodded, and left the counter, stepping into a back room. The look she gave Orion, equal parts sorrow, anger, and confusion, burned itself into his memory. He found himself speechless. All he'd wanted was a quick fuel up. How had it come to this? Gromas gestured curtly. I'll charge your credit shit for the fuel. You'll get your ship refilled, but you're not leaving this planet until this matter is resolved. Orion swallowed hard. All right, fine. He could feel the weight of condemnation pressing in from every pair of eyes. He scooped up the severed bracelets from the counter, examined them for a moment, then set them aside, not sure what else to do. He silently followed Gromas out into the blazing afternoon, mind spinning with questions and frustration. The dusty heat assaulted him again, scouring his exposed skin. Outside, Gromas's demeanor was calmer, though still tense. He led Orion through winding alleys of corrugated metal walls, some with bright cloth awnings that offered minor relief from the glaring sun. Finally, they reached a squat building nestled against a rocky hill. A chipped sign near the door read Gromas's storage and accommodations. Gromas gestured Orion inside. Compared to the scorching outdoors, the interior was somewhat cooler, with fans whirring overhead. The main room had a cobbled-together desk, shelves of spare parts, and a corner that looked like a communal living space. A battered couch sat near a small table stacked with half-empty mugs and data tablets. Gromas sank into a chair behind the desk, laced his thick fingers together, and stared at Orion. We must talk terms, he began. Eileen's parents died a long time ago, and I've raised her under our laws. She's a good girl, prized among our people. By removing those bracelets, you essentially forced a vow upon yourself. Orion sighed and raked a hand through his hair. Look, I made a mistake. I genuinely thought she was enslaved. I've encountered that kind of tech used for less honorable purposes. I'm sorry. Your intentions don't change the result. Our tradition is absolute. The wedding must take place, or else she'll be disgraced, and so will I. Word spreads fast, and if the community believes she lost her purity out of wedlock, he trailed off ominously. Orion bristled. I have no wish to disgrace her, but I'm not exactly looking to get married. He thought of his entire life, flying from system to system, no attachments. A jolt of panic twisted in his gut. Could you accept a financial settlement? Compensation? Gromas shook his head. This is beyond credits. The only way to restore her honor is to go through with the wedding, at least for one local lunar cycle. After that, we can arrange a dissolution if you still want to part ways. 1 month, Orion thought. That was about 30 days standard. Not forever, but an eternity for someone like him. Yet he didn't see any alternative that wouldn't devastate Eileen's life. He could hardly bear the memory of her tear-streaked face. He might have despised local customs, but he couldn't walk away knowing he'd effectively destroyed her future. With a deep breath, he forced himself to meet Gromez's unwavering gaze. "I'll do it," he said softly. "But it ends in a month, yes?" "That's what the law allows," Gromez said, relief easing the stern set of his features. "If, at that time, both parties decide there's no reason to continue, the marriage can be dissolved." Orion nodded, exhaling slowly. "Fine. I'll do whatever rites are required." Gromez rose and extended a hand that felt like it could crush steel. They shook on it. "Then you'll stay in my guest quarters tonight, and tomorrow we hold the ceremony at dusk." A moment later, a door to the back room opened, and Eileen stepped out. She had splashed water on her face to wash away the tears, but her eyes were still puffy. She paused, unsure whether to approach. Gromez beckoned her. She moved to stand. Beside her uncle's desk, arms folded tightly, as though defending herself from the entire situation. Orion felt another pang of guilt. She was truly lovely, with that faint shimmering quality to her skin. Her hair, parted down one side, revealed pointed ears just subtle enough that from a distance one might mistake her for a human. He realized, in an unexpected moment of self-awareness, that he'd never known a woman of her species before. He wondered how many cultural nuances he'd trample next. Gromez explained the arrangement. Eileen didn't speak as he laid it out. That Orion had agreed, that the ceremony would be tomorrow at dusk, that it would be a temporary union, if they so chose. Eileen nodded mechanically. "Understood," she said, voice taut. Gromez dismissed her with a quiet instruction to prepare a space for Orion to sleep in. When she was gone, Gromez faced Orion again. "I hope you realize that this is the only way to salvage her honor. Treat her well." Orion nodded. "I'll do my best." And so he spent the remainder of that blazing day, cooped up in a spare room behind Gromez's supply shelves, listening to the hum of overhead fans and the murmur of people outside. He could neither leave nor do anything more than reflect on how drastically his life had changed in the span of a single hour. That evening, Gromez brought him a plate of hot spiced vegetables and grilled meat from a native frontier lizard. Orion wasn't sure he had any appetite, but after a day of tension, he forced down some of the meal. He spent the night twisting in the small cot, drifting in and out of uneasy dreams about metal bracelets and eyes filled with tears. The next morning arrived with the red sun glaring in through a dusty window. The day of the wedding. A concept that felt so surreal he half believed it was a dream. But no, it was very real. Gromez came by early, gruffly announcing there would be a midday meeting to finalize details. Then the ceremony would be held outdoors at dusk, as per local custom. Orion stood in a makeshift washroom, splashing water over his face and trying to gather himself. He felt trapped, but as he closed his eyes, he remembered Eileen's obvious distress and reminded himself that he was doing the honorable thing. This was not a cage in the sense of a legal contract forcing him for life. It was a short-term vow, a fix for the problem he'd unintentionally created. A month. He could survive that. Then he'd be free to go. He found Eileen sitting at a table near the front of the outpost, carefully stitching a length of cloth. She looked up shyly when he approached, and her cheeks flushed. He saw two faint circular marks on each wrist, where the bracelets once glowed. She made a reflexive move to hide them, then lowered her hands to her lap instead. He cleared his throat. "Morning." She barely nodded. "Morning." An uncomfortable silence stretched. Orion shifted on his feet. I'm sorry about all this. If there was a way to fix it without dragging you into a marriage, I would." Her eyes flickered with mixed emotions. "I know, but our laws are strict. The bracelets they're not just decorative. They're a vow. When you cut them, it signaled the vow was broken." She hesitated. "I'm not angry that you tried to rescue me, but this is..." She trailed off. He nodded. "I get it." They sat in tense quiet for another moment until footsteps signaled Gromez's arrival. He proceeded to instruct them in the local traditions. They would meet an elder from the settlement who would speak words of union. Eileen would wear a new set of ceremonial accessories, different from the purity bracelets, more akin to wedding jewelry that symbolized their bond. Orion would affirm that he was taking on responsibility for her honor. The entire settlement would attend. He caught a glimpse of Eileen's face during Gromaz's explanation. A hint of sorrow remained, but there was also a faint acceptance. She was going through with it, likely because she had no other choice. Orion felt his chest tighten. It was one thing to have a no-strings life, another thing to be the cause of someone losing the freedom to choose her partner. Even if the ceremony was short-term, it carried emotional weight. He couldn't ignore that. By late afternoon, the settlement erupted in a flurry of activity. People strung primitive lanterns around a cleared space between the outpost buildings. A makeshift archway was assembled from twisted metal scraps and draped in vivid cloth. A group of older women escorted Eileen away, presumably to help her prepare. Orion was left to pace anxiously in Gromaz's living area, wearing an unfamiliar style of formal jacket made from coarse local fabric. He had parted with a handful of credits for it when one of Gromaz's friends insisted no one should attend their wedding in dusty travel clothes. As the sun sank, painting the horizon in pink and orange, Gromaz gestured for Orion to come outside. The entire outpost had gathered, forming a circle around the archway. A small band played a rhythmic, haunting melody on stringed instruments with metallic overtones. The air smelled of spiced meats and the tang of local liquor. When Eileen appeared, Orion barely recognized her. She wore a flowing drape of cloth that shimmered in the fading sunlight, dyed in tones of soft gold that complemented the reflective sheen of her skin. Tiny ornaments hung in her hair, catching the breeze. Though her gaze was pinned to the ground in embarrassment, she looked breathtaking. His chest constricted with an unfamiliar sense of awe and guilt all at once. An elderly woman stepped forward, holding a carved wooden staff. She was introduced to Orion as the settlement's matriarch. She signaled them to stand beneath the arch. The hush of the crowd was palpable. Orion forced himself to meet Eileen's eyes. She glanced back uncertainly, her cheeks flushed. The matriarch began speaking in a language Orion mostly didn't understand. Her tone was solemn, a slight vibrato in her voice. After a moment, Gromaz, standing near them, translated key statements in a low whisper. She asked them both if they entered this union willingly. Orion cleared his throat, feeling hundreds of eyes on him. "I do," he managed, though the words stuck. Eileen's voice followed in a near whisper. "I do." The matriarch extended a small metallic cord, handing it to Orion. He wound it gently around Eileen's wrists, not too tight, then around his own left wrist. That, Gromaz explained, symbolized that they were bound together for the mandated cycle of the local moon. The matriarch chanted a few final lines, then touched her staff to the cord. A faint spark traveled the length of it. "You are wed," Gromaz whispered. Applause broke out around them, along with cheers and whistles. Eileen's hands trembled under the cord. Orion gently unwound it, mindful not to bruise the faint red marks still visible for where the original bracelets had been cut. Once free, they were pressed into an onrush of well-wishers. Some brought them drinks, others offered handshakes or claps on the shoulder. Music started again, this time more jubilant. A group of older men ushered Orion away toward a table covered in cups of strong-smelling liquor. The men insisted he drink in celebration. He tried a cautious sip. The flavor was pungent, reminiscent of fermented cactus with a peppery burn, but the men roared in approval and demanded a toast. He gave a half-smile, raising the cup. He glanced across the crowd, searching for Eileen. She was surrounded by a gaggle of local women, possibly receiving instructions or simply being congratulated. He noticed her expression, tense yet polite. As the music carried on, he found a moment to slip away and approach her. She had just escaped the throng of people and looked relieved to see him. They stood awkwardly together beneath one of the lanterns, the night air still hot but softening in the breeze. "How are you?" he asked quietly. She hesitated. "All right. Tired. Overwhelmed." He nodded, exhaling. "Me too. Look, I know this is a marriage in name only, but for as long as we're in it, I want you to be comfortable, to do what you need to do. If that means living in separate quarters, or... She regarded him with a trace of surprise. Thank you, she said simply. I just need time to get used to all of this. Of course. Before they could speak more, several villagers asked them to join a celebratory dance. Orion shot Eileen a glance. She shrugged slightly, and they were pulled into a ring of people moving in a slow, circling motion to the music's steady beat. He followed as best he could, feeling clumsy. Eileen stepped lightly, her shimmering garment fluttering around her ankles, the ornaments in her hair chiming. He found himself momentarily entranced by her grace, as if her body already knew the steps by instinct. When the dancing ended, the onlookers dispersed into smaller groups, enjoying food and drink. Gromas, leaning against a post, beckoned Orion to join him. Orion approached warily, still not certain how Gromas truly felt about him. Congratulations, Gromas said, not without a hint of irony. Now that this is official, you'll come live in my spare lodging until the cycle's done. Eileen can stay in her usual quarters, or you both can decide otherwise. Orion nodded. I appreciate the hospitality. He cleared his throat, figuring it couldn't hurt to express his sincerity. I might not be from here, but I do respect the fact that you've raised her well and want what's best for her. Gromas regarded him for a long moment. If that's truly the case, then perhaps we can put this rocky start behind us, he said. Just remember that you may be her husband now, but that doesn't give you free rein to treat her badly. I understand, Orion said. You have my word. Eventually, the party wound down. The dusty street emptied, and the lanterns were extinguished one by one until only the dim overhead. Lights remained. Orion wandered near the edge of the settlement, where the Phoenix was parked. He gazed at his ship's silhouette and sighed, thinking of the open stars. It was an ache inside him, this restlessness. But he couldn't just climb aboard and leave now. He heard a soft step and turned to find Eileen behind him, still dressed in the shimmering cloth. She looked uncertain, arms wrapped around herself. It's weird to call you husband, she admitted quietly, watching him with cautious eyes. Orion huffed a wry laugh. Trust me, it's weird to hear it. I've spent my life avoiding that word. She moved closer until they stood side by side, looking at the ship. That's your vessel? Yes. Old, but reliable. And it's all I've ever really needed. She and I get along. He hesitated, then glanced at her. I heard rumors you're good with flight simulators. She lifted one shoulder in a shrug. I've only ever flown in a patched-up virtual rig that my uncle keeps for training. But I've dreamed about leaving this planet my whole life. He took a step toward the Phoenix's ramp. Do you want to see the cockpit? Might as well show you a glimpse of the outside world. Her eyes brightened for an instant. Then she looked down at her elaborate wedding attire, cheeks coloring. Not tonight. I'm still overwhelmed. He nodded, acknowledging the swirl of emotions she must be experiencing. Fair enough. Another time. They parted ways near Gromas's lodging. She disappeared into one room, and Orion into the spare he'd been using. He undressed and lay on the cot, staring at the cracked ceiling. He felt no clearer about how to navigate this predicament, only certain that it would transform his routine more than he liked. Morning came, and with it, a swirl of new complications. The settlement had plenty of visitors, miners, traders, and occasional traveler. They all had heard the story. The outworlder who cut off purity bracelets and married the local girl. Whispers trailed Orion when he stepped into the makeshift market to buy a few items for his ship. He tried to ignore the hushed gossip, focusing on the fact that soon enough, in a month's time, he could choose to dissolve this bond and move on. An unexpected message came through on his comm device around midday. His old contact, a shady broker named Kieran, had a job for him. Retrieve a data core from an abandoned research station orbiting a small planetoid not far from Frontier 7. The pay was substantial, enough to offset the fuel and then some. The only catch was that Kieran insisted on immediate turnaround. If Orion didn't collect the data core in the next few days, the job would be lost. He found Eileen in Gromas's workshop, helping sort parts for a client. She glanced up at him, eyebrows lifting in quiet question. About a job, he said. I planned on fueling up and leaving, circumstances have changed. Still, this job has a tight deadline. If I don't go soon, I'll miss out. She set aside the part she was holding. So, you're leaving me here? He paused. Right. The marriage bond. He couldn't simply vanish without consequence. I suppose I could go alone and come back. It'll only take a day or two, maybe less. But your uncle might not trust me to return. Eileen frowned. He'd insist I go with you to ensure you don't run off. Orion rubbed his jaw. That's what I was thinking. I know it might be dangerous, but this job isn't exactly high risk for what I've been told. The station's abandoned. At worst, I'll have to break in, grab the data core, and leave. I can handle that. She rose. I want to see space. If you'd let me come along, I'd like to, but I've never been off-world. I don't know what it's really like. He remembered how her eyes lit up at the mention of flying. Despite everything else, there was a spark of hope in her, a longing to explore beyond these dusty hills. He gave a short nod. Then let's talk to Gromas. Gromas wasn't thrilled about it, but Eileen insisted, with an uncharacteristic firmness in her voice, that she should see at least a little of what lay beyond Frontier 7. Gromas glared at Orion, as though blaming him for leading his niece astray, but eventually relented. He made Orion promise a safe return. Orion promised. That afternoon, they packed a few supplies and climbed into the Phoenix. Eileen, stepping aboard, took in every panel, every worn seat, and worn metal walkway with wide-eyed wonder. Orion noticed how delicate her fingers looked as she trailed them along the walls. She was an unusual bride, forced by tradition, yet yearning for a cosmic horizon. The contradiction both amused and unsettled him. Strap in, Orion told her when they reached the cockpit. He showed her how to secure the harness across her shoulders. Takeoff can be bumpy if the stabilizers don't adjust to the local gravity well. She nodded eagerly, though nervousness flickered behind her eyes. He fired up the engines, and the ship rumbled beneath them. The hull trembled, dust swirling around the viewport as the thrusters kicked in. Then the Phoenix lifted off, escaping the planet's grasp. Eileen's breath caught as she watched the ground shrink away, the outpost becoming a dot in the sprawling desert. Soon they broke through the upper atmosphere, revealing a black sky streaked with stars. A stunned gasp escaped her. "It's so vast," she murmured, pressing her face closer to the viewport. "Gorgeous, isn't it?" Orion said, recalling his first time in space. He'd been a boy stowing away on a transport, face plastered to the window the entire flight. She nodded, speechless. As the ship cleared Frontier 7's orbit, she gazed at the round planet below, swirling dust storms at the poles, narrow glints of water in the cracks of its continents. She seemed enthralled by the brilliant glow of the star off the planet's curve. Orion input the coordinates Kieran had given him, programming the autopilot for a short jump. "We'll be in FDL for about an hour," he explained. "The station orbits an uninhabited planetoid. Used to be some corporation's lab, I hear. They abandoned it months ago." Eileen nodded, leaning back in the co-pilot's seat. "I never thought I'd leave the planet. Now here I am, married to an off-worlder. In space." He felt a twinge of discomfort at the mention of marriage. "It's temporary," he reminded gently. "Yes," she said quietly. Their eyes met. His chest tightened. The scenario was so bizarre. Two strangers forced into a binding vow, now alone together in the hush of space. He cleared his throat. "Let me show you the rest of the ship. Might help you pass the time." She unbuckled and followed him. He showed her the compact galley, the single bunk he called a captain's cabin, the cargo hold where he kept extra gear and spare parts. She asked questions about each piece of equipment, her curiosity tireless. He realized that beneath her shy demeanor was a keen intellect, hungry for knowledge. When they returned to the cockpit, she tentatively asked if he'd let her try handling some basic controls once they dropped out of FTL. The interest in her voice was immediate. He shrugged. "Sure, if conditions are safe." They slipped into the swirling haze of faster-than-light travel. The starry void outside distorted into ribbons of color. Eileen watched the phenomenon in open awe. After about an hour, the Phoenix reverted to normal space near a lonely planetoid. The station came into view on sensors, an angular structure orbiting the rocky sphere below. From a distance, the station looked unlit except for a scattering of faint red beacons that indicated a minimal power supply. Orion scanned for life signs. "No big readings," he muttered, "but we'll keep our guard up." He offered Eileen the co-pilot seat again and talked her through some of the approach maneuvers. She caught on quickly, her hands dancing over the controls with surprising skill for someone who'd only used simulations. They docked with a dull clang, magnetically sealing to the station's external airlock. Orion powered down most systems, leaving enough to run the thrusters if they needed a quick getaway. "Stay close to me," he instructed, passing her a small handheld emitter that functioned as a stun device. "Point and press if you see anything threatening." She swallowed. "Understood." They cycled through the airlock and stepped inside. The corridors were dim, illuminated by flickering emergency lights. Abandoned crates and overturned chairs indicated a hasty evacuation. A stale odor of disuse clung to the metal walls. Orion led with his blaster drawn, scanning every corner. They found a research labs lined with dark consoles and shattered glass panels. The hush of the station pressed in on them like a weight. Eileen's voice echoed softly in the gloom. Why did they leave so abruptly? Orion shook his head. Funny cuts, maybe, or a corporate meltdown. Sometimes labs are shut down due to dangerous experiments. I never get the full story in these gigs. They reached the central data repository. Orion removed a portable hacking device from his belt, hooking it to the console. The system whirred to life, green code scrolling by as the device forced its way in. After a few minutes, the device beeped. Orion pulled out a small metal cube etched with ports. "This must be the data core," he said. "Kieran wants it. I just hope we're not doing some corporation's dirty work." He tucked it into a secure pouch. "Let's get out of here." They retraced their steps. As they neared the docking corridor, a sudden clang echoed. Orion froze, adrenaline spiking. Eileen gripped her stun emitter. Distant footsteps rang through the metal halls. Then voices, low and rough, drifted closer, biting back a curse. Orion ushered her behind a row of stacked crates. He peered around the edge, spotting 3 figures clad in battered armor. They carried rifles that glinted in the emergency lights. Possibly pirates or scavengers. They looked as if they knew exactly what they were after, scanning doorways and rummaging through compartments. One of them barked a short command. Another responded in a language Orion didn't understand. The 3 advanced down the corridor, straight toward the labs they'd just left. Orion motioned silently for Eileen to stay put while he weighed options. If the intruders found them, a shootout was inevitable. He hoped they could slip away to the ship unnoticed. He gestured for Eileen to follow him in the opposite direction, keeping low. They scurried along a side passage, only to find a sealed bulkhead that refused to open. Orion tried hacking it with his device, but it required overrides he didn't have time to decode. Behind them, the voices came closer. He grit his teeth. "We're going to have to fight through," he whispered. Eileen's fingers trembled on the stun emitter. She nodded, though fear shone in her eyes. Orion readied his plasma pistol. He flanked one side of the corridor. The first intruder rounded the corner. Orion squeezed the trigger, sending a bolt sizzling. The intruder jerked, letting out a guttural cry. The other 2 ducked for cover, returning fire. Energy blasts whizzed past Orion, lighting up the corridor. Eileen, eyes wide, fired blindly. She missed, but it kept the intruders pinned. Orion took advantage, popping out to land a direct shot that sent one intruder crumpling. But the third fired a volley that singed Orion's jacket and forced him back. More frantic exchanges of plasma lit the darkness. Orion hissed under his breath. They were outnumbered. At best, he might take them down if he was lucky, but Eileen was at risk. Weaving between blasts, Orion decided to move. "We have to get back to the Phoenix." "Run," he commanded. They sprinted down the corridor, the overhead lights flickering erratically. The intruders shouted and tore after them. Orion felt the burn of an energy bolt slice across his upper arm, stinging painfully. Eileen yelped as a blast scorched the wall near her. They rounded the final corner and dashed into the docking bay. The Phoenix's hatch stood open. Orion shoved Eileen up the ramp. The intruders were close behind, shots ricocheting off the metal bulkheads. One shot grazed Orion's leg, nearly buckling him, but he stumbled inside. He slapped the control to seal the hatch. The pirates pounded on the hull, but the Phoenix's sealed environment would hold. He limped to the cockpit, cursing under his breath. Eileen helped him along, hooking an arm under his shoulder. "How bad is it?" she asked, voice trembling. He gritted his teeth. "I'll live. Get in the pilot's seat. I'll handle the rest from here." She froze in panic. The pilot's seat? But just do it. He groaned, slumping into the co-pilot chair. He keyed in emergency startup. The engines roared to life, the docking clamp trying to hold them in place. A sensor beep indicated a manual override was needed from the pilot console. Eileen, swallowing her nerves, reached for the controls. Her hands moved with an echo of muscle memory from countless hours spent in simulations. She typed the override sequence Orion rasped out between gritted teeth. The Phoenix shuddered. Another flurry of blasts pummeled the hull from outside. The docking clamp creaked. With a final mechanical hiss, the clamp released. Eileen throttled up. The ship lurched forward and jerked free of the station. Within seconds, they were in open space. Grimacing from pain, Orion forced his eyes open to read the sensor displays. "They might have a ship. We need to burn fast." Eileen nodded, pushing the thrusters. The Phoenix shot forward, the station's silhouette shrinking in the viewport. Sure enough, a battered freighter detached from another docking bay, turning to pursue. It fired pulse beams, but they fell short. Eileen angled the ship, scanning for a safe FTL route. Orion rattled off coordinates, ignoring the throbbing in his leg. Then, with a surge of energy, they jumped into faster than light, leaving their attackers behind. When the swirling lights of FTL enveloped them, Orion sagged in relief, adrenaline crashing. Eileen flicked autopilot on, then knelt beside him. She pushed up the torn fabric of his pant leg. The burn was raw and ugly, but not deep enough to cripple him permanently. "Stay still," she said, voice shaking. She fumbled for the med kit he kept stowed under the cockpit console. With surprisingly steady hands, she cleaned and dressed the wound, biting her lip in concentration. He winced, chest tight from the pain. Yet he felt oddly comforted by her gentle touch. "You did good," he managed, swallowing a hiss of discomfort. "Flying us out of there." She exhaled a trembling breath. I can't believe we made it." He noticed, for the first time, how close she was, how the subtle glow of her skin reflected the overhead lights. She finished bandaging him, carefully fastening the wrap. Her eyes lifted, meeting his. "I'm sorry you got hurt," she whispered. "I should have been faster. You saved our lives." He mustered a grin, but it quickly fell into a grimace of pain. "Let's just say you handled your first real flight a lot better than most rookies. We'll head back to Frontier 7 once we're safe from pursuit." Eileen nodded and settled into the pilot's seat, scanning readouts. Orion limped to the bunk area. He lay down, letting the dull ache in his leg fade under the med gel's numbing effect. After a few minutes of rest, he called Eileen to the cabin so she could help him properly disinfect the wound. She hovered nervously at first, but when he guided her step by step, she overcame her apprehension and assisted with calm focus. He was struck by her determination. She seemed so timid at times, yet there was a well of courage in her that surfaced under stress. By the time they dropped out of FTL near Frontier 7, Eileen felt more confident at the helm. Orion watched from the co-pilot's seat as she executed the approach sequence. Despite exhaustion and the stinging pain in his leg, he was oddly proud of her. The landing was slightly rough, but nothing the ship couldn't handle. When the Phoenix settled on the dusty pad, Groma's was already waiting. He marched up the ramp, scowling, his eyes raking Orion's injury. "This is what happens when you step off-world," he grumbled. But then his face softened as he looked at Eileen. "Thank the stars you're all right." She gave a tired nod, leaning against the corridor wall. "Uncle, we ran into scavengers at the station. Orion was hurt, but we got the data core." Gromas helped Orion hobble down the ramp. They led him into the outpost's infirmary, such as it was, a single room with a cot, a supply cabinet, and an ancient diagnostic machine. A grizzled medic patched Orion up further. Through it all, Eileen sat near his side, occasionally wiping sweat from his brow and asking if he was okay. Something had shifted between them. No longer strangers forced into a vow. They'd braved real danger together. That night, Orion managed to limp around on his own. He returned to Gromas's lodging to rest. Eileen appeared at the door, lingering shyly in the hallway. He beckoned her inside. "You can come in." She stepped softly across the threshold. Her expression was uncertain, but he could see a new resolve in her. "You realize," she said, "that it felt strangely good to be out there among the stars. I see now why you roam so freely." He leaned back against a creaking chair, trying not to jar his wounded leg. "It's all I've ever known." He paused. "I guess, ironically, I've never let myself be tied down. Then I come here and end up tied by your people's custom." He gave a rueful smile. "But you know something? These last couple days, flying with you, it didn't feel like a trap. Strange as that sounds." Her cheeks warmed with color. She took a hesitant step closer. "Maybe it doesn't have to be a trap. Even if it began as an obligation, we can figure out a way to make it work. At least until the month is up." He studied her. She had changed clothes from the dusty flight gear to a simple cotton shift. The marks on her wrists were fading, the red lines almost gone. He realized he no longer saw her as a fragile victim. She was resourceful and braver than he'd guessed. "If you want to keep exploring with me during that month, I'm fine with it," he said carefully. "We can run jobs, see how we function as a team." The word wife lodged in his mind, but he wasn't sure how to voice it. She answered with a half smile, eyes shining softly. "All right, husband, let's do that." And so began an unexpected partnership. Over the next week, Orion spent time recuperating while Eileen assisted Gromas at the outpost. She also visited the Phoenix daily, studying its systems with an eager mind. Occasionally, Orion would catch her running simulations on the ship's console. She was methodical, and each day her confidence rose. One afternoon, Orion finally decided to examine the data core they'd retrieved. He suspected it might hold valuable corporate secrets, but curiosity got the better of him. With some hacking tools, he cracked the encryption. Streams of data poured out, a series of star charts, resource surveys, and plans for a large-scale occupation. The documents referenced Frontier 7 specifically. It seemed some large consortium had designs on the region, analyzing local populations and planetary assets in preparation for a takeover. He felt a rush of anger. This data core was a blueprint for subjugating Frontier 7 and other borderline worlds. His contact, Kieran, obviously intended to sell it to a corporate power or pass it to a bigger client who would exploit it. Orion's jaw tightened. He realized that by delivering the core, he might be dooming Eileen's world to infiltration or invasion. Eileen found him hunched over the console, reading the files with mounting alarm. "Orion? What is all this?" He explained. Her eyes widened in horror. "They want to claim Frontier 7's resources. Our farmland, the minerals in the mountains. They'll push us out or enslave us under new management." He grimaced, shutting the terminal. "I had no idea." Kira never said anything about it being a planetary takeover plan. "If I deliver this core, I'll be giving them everything they need." Eileen's face was pale. "You can't give it to them. You can't let them do that." He allowed a slow breath. "I know, but they'll come after me if I don't. People like that don't just let a valuable data core disappear. I'm also sure they have other ways to get the intel, eventually. But if we hold on to it, we could delay them, maybe expose them." She squared her shoulders. "We have to protect the settlement. Maybe we can warn them. Raise defenses." He considered it. "I can call in some favors. Hire a few contacts I trust. Set up perimeter defense. This planet is a tough place, but it's not ready for a corporate invasion." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Are you sure you want to tie yourself and me further into this? My entire life, I've avoided bigger conflicts. But now I find myself actually caring about what happens here." Eileen touched his arm gently. "It's our home. And whether we planned it or not, you've become part of this place through me. I'd be grateful if you helped us stand against whoever tries to take our freedom." Her words resonated. He thought of the moment she guided the Phoenix away from the station, determined to keep them alive. She wanted to defend her people with that same determination. Against his usual instincts, Orion realized he couldn't turn away. Something had changed in him, an impulse that wasn't just about money or personal freedom. Perhaps, ironically, it was about a new kind of freedom, the kind that came from belonging. They took the data core to Gromas. He stared at the files in shock, then nodded gravely. He agreed that the settlement needed to prepare. Some of the villagers had experience with off-world threats. Others had connections. Quietly, a network of resistance began to form. Orion called in contact from scattered frontier stations, paying for shipments of weapons and shield generators. The outpost turned into a covert hub of activity. Even the dusty, run-down buildings took on new life as people fortified them. Weeks slipped by, each day forging a stronger bond between Orion and Eileen. They were, by local law, husband and wife, but it began to feel less like a forced arrangement and more like an earnest partnership. They shared stories. Orion told her of exotic worlds he'd visited, from the crystal spires of Lorien Prime to the floating cities of Aurelia. Eileen recounted bits of her childhood, how she dreamed of starlight beyond the desert sky. As his leg healed, Orion worked to outfit the Phoenix for potential skirmishes, upgrading shields and installing additional weaponry. Eileen proved invaluable, her quick learning from the simulations allowing her to navigate diagnostic tools with uncanny ease. Sometimes they spent hours in the cockpit, Eileen practicing maneuvers, Orion offering tips. If any threat from Kieran or a corporate fleet arrived, they wanted to be ready. The settlement's new sense of unity buoyed Eileen's spirits, and Orion noticed that she walked with greater confidence, no longer the shy girl behind a counter. The faint marks on her wrists had all but vanished, replaced by subtle scars that served as a reminder of what set their entire journey in motion. Occasionally, when she caught him looking at those scars, she'd give him a little smile, as if to say, "This is where we began, but look how far we've come." One quiet evening, Orion was in the docking bay, checking the Phoenix's refitted thrusters. Eileen appeared with 2 ceramic mugs of local spiced tea. They sat side by side on a crate, sipping the bittersweet brew and gazing at the starlit sky overhead, where the hangar roof opened to the night. She tilted her head, letting the warm breeze brush across her cheeks. "You said once that you had no ties. You liked it that way. Has that changed?" He studied the steam curling from his mug. "I won't lie, it's still strange to me. The idea of having a home, a partner. But traveling alone." He paused, remembering 1,000 lonely nights drifting through the void. "It never bothered me before. It does now, because I know that if I left, I'd be leaving something worthwhile." A gentle light shone in her eyes. "I feel the same about you." She reached for his free hand, lacing her slender fingers through his calloused ones. "Our month is almost up, Orion. In just a few days, we'll have to choose if we dissolve our bond. But I'm not sure I want to." His heart thudded. The notion that he might not end the marriage was one he had tried to avoid, but had crept into his mind with increasing frequency. "I've been thinking about that," he admitted. "Truth is, I never expected to say this, but maybe we should extend it. Maybe we should be together, really together." She exhaled, relief mingled with hope shimmering in her face. "I would like that if you truly want it." He set his mug aside and turned fully toward her. "Eileen, I want it. You can still come with me on the Phoenix, see the galaxy. We can come back to Frontier 7 whenever we need to. I know it won't always be easy. There might be trouble from the corporate side, but we can handle it." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead lightly to his. "Then let's not just talk about it. Let's do it." The warmth of her breath and the closeness of her presence made his chest swell with an emotion he struggled to name. Gratitude? Affection? Something deeper. She closed the final distance, their lips touching in a tentative, gentle kiss. He felt the hum of her shimmering skin under his hands. It was a moment of quiet realization. He had cut off her bracelets to set her free, but she made him see that freedom could be shared. The next day, they informed Gromas of their decision to remain husband and wife beyond the initial cycle. Gromas looked stoic, but his eyes revealed approval. A few other villagers teased Orion good-naturedly, calling him the outworlder who found a home. He took it in stride. In truth, it felt right. They organized a more personal celebration, smaller, less formal than the ceremony. A close circle of friends and acquaintances gathered, toasting them with that pungent local liquor. Eileen wore a simpler dress, yet even more beautiful in Orion's eyes, for it was her choice. She had replaced the severed bracelets with new ornaments that Orion had crafted from starship metal and local gemstones, symbolizing a vow made not under forced tradition, but out of genuine commitment. That evening, they stood at the settlement's outskirts, side by side, gazing at the horizon where the dust parted to reveal faint mountains. Orion draped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her closer. Beyond them lay the unknown threat of corporate fleets, the wide expanse of star systems, countless potential adventures. But it also lay the promise of forging a life together in a way neither of them had expected. She turned her face up to him. "Thank you." "For what?" A soft laugh escaped her. "For cutting those bracelets." He smirked. "You do know that nearly got both of us exiled, right? Yet here we are." Her lips curved in a gentle smile. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was a clumsy mistake that turned into something miraculous. He brushed a strand of her hair aside, contentment settling in his chest. Let's call it both. In the days that followed, Orion accepted that his life wouldn't be defined solely by solitary wandering. He and Eileen prepared the Phoenix for a new run. There were still leads to follow, rumors of corporate survey vessels in neighboring systems. They intended to keep Frontier 7 safe by intercepting or redirecting any threat they could. On one of those last nights before departure, they walked hand in hand through the outpost, greeting neighbors who once viewed Orion as a meddling stranger. Now, they hailed him as a local hero, or at least a local ally. He handled the attention with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. Finally, the morning came to launch. Groma stood by, arms folded, expression gruff. "Take care of her," he said to Orion. Then to Eileen, "And don't forget your old uncle if you see new markets out there. Or you find a place that sells better lubricants for my machines." Eileen laughed, hugging him. "I won't forget. I promise we'll be back whenever we can." Orion and Eileen climbed the ramp, the engines humming in readiness. Once inside the cockpit, they shared a quick glance. This time, Eileen slipped into the pilot's seat by mutual agreement. Orion took co-pilot. Together, they lifted off, the desert sands swirling beneath them, the settlement shrinking into a tiny speck. A new path opened overhead. The Phoenix soared toward the starry vault, engines carrying them up into the infinite realm beyond the sky. As the planet fell away, Orion took Eileen's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She returned the gesture, shining with excitement and nerves. He keyed in coordinates for the next system, where rumors said a corporate scout vessel had been spotted. They might confront danger, but they would face it together. The thrusters whined, propelling them into the darkness. The stars stretched out in radiant patterns. For a moment, he recalled the single, decisive instant in which his laser cutter had sliced those two glowing bracelets from her wrists. It was such a small motion with such enormous consequences. Yet, as her hand remained entwined in his, he couldn't regret it. He'd found a partner, a friend, and perhaps something more lasting than any vow or contract he'd ever known. "I removed her bracelets to set her free," he murmured quietly, almost to himself, "and she freed me in return." Eileen heard him, her lips curving into a soft smile. Then she pushed the throttle forward, and the Phoenix, with husband and wife at the controls, vanished into the shining tapestry of space.